The Land Ironclads by H.G. Wells. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Sames. The Land Ironclads by H.G. Wells. The young lieutenant lay beside the war correspondent and admired the idyllic calm of the enemy's lines through his field glass. "So far as I can see," he said at last, "one man." "What's he doing?" asked the war correspondent. "Field glass at us," said the young lieutenant. "And this is war?" "No," said the young lieutenant. "It's block. The game's a draw." "No, they've got to win or else they lose. A draw's a win for our side." They had discussed the political situation 50 times or so, and the war correspondent was weary of it. He stretched out his limbs. "Suppose it is," he yawned. Flut! What was that? Shot at us. The war correspondent shifted to a slightly lower position. "No one shot at him," he complained. "I wonder if they think we shall get so bored we shall go home." The war correspondent made no reply. "There's the harvest, of course." They had been there a month. Since the first brisk movements after the declaration of war, things had gone slower and slower, until it seemed as though the whole machine of events must have run down. To begin with, they had had almost a scampering time. The invader had come across the frontier on the very dawn of the war, in half a dozen parallel columns behind a cloud of cyclists and cavalry, with a general air of coming straight on the capital, and the defender horsemen had held him up and peppered him and forced him to open out to outflank, and had then bolted to the next position in the most approved style for a couple of days, until in the afternoon, bump, they had the invader against their prepared lines of defence. He did not suffer so much as had been hoped and expected. He was coming on, it seemed, with his eyes open. His scouts winded the guns, and down he sat at once without the shadow of an attack, and began grubbing trenches for himself, as though he meant to sit down there to the very end of time. He was slow, but much more wary than the world had been led to expect, and he kept convoys tucked in, and shielded his slow-marching infantry sufficiently well to prevent any heavy adverse scoring. "But he ought to attack," the young lieutenant had insisted. "He'll attack us at dawn somewhere along the lines. You'll get the bayonets coming into the trenches just about when you can see." The war correspondent had held until a week ago. The young lieutenant winked when he said that. When one early morning the men the defenders sent to lie out 500 yards before the trenches, with a view to the unexpected emptying of magazines into any night attack, gave way to causeless panic and blazed away at nothing for 10 minutes, the war correspondent understood the meaning of that wink. "What would you do if you were the enemy?" said the war correspondent suddenly. "If I had men like I've got now?" "Yes." "Take those trenches." "How?" "Oh, dodges. Crawl out halfway at night before moonrise and get into touch with the chaps we send out. Blaze at 'em if they tried to shift, and so bag some of 'em in the daylight. Learn that patch of ground by heart. Lie all day in squatty holes, and come on nearer next night. There's a bit over there, lumpy ground, where they could get across to rushing distance easy, in a night or so. It would be a mere game for our fellows. It's what they're made for. Guns? Shrapnel and stuff wouldn't stop good men who meant business." "Why don't they do that?" "Their men aren't brutes enough, that's the trouble. They're a crowd of devitalized townsmen, and that's the truth of the matter. They're clerks, they're factory hands, they're students, they're civilized men. They can write, they can talk, they can make and do all sorts of things, but they're poor amateurs at war. They've got no physical staying power, and that's the whole thing. They've never slept in the open one night in their lives. They've never drunk anything but the purest water company water. They've never gone short of 3 meals a day since they left their devitalizing feeding bottles. Half their cavalry never cocked leg over horse till it enlisted 6 months ago. They ride their horses as though they were bicycles. You watch 'em. They're fools at the game, and they know it. Our boys of 14 can give their grown men points. Very well." The war correspondent mused on his face with his nose between his knuckles. "If a decent civilization," he said, "cannot produce better men for war than—" He stopped with belated politeness. "I mean, than our open-air life," said the young lieutenant politely. "Exactly," said the war correspondent. "Then civilization has to stop." "It looks like it," the young lieutenant admitted. "Civilization has science, you know," said the war correspondent. "It invented and it makes the rifles and guns and things you use, which our nice healthy hunters and stockmen and so on, rowdy-dowdy cowpunchers and nigger-whackers, can use 10 times better than—" "What's that?" "What?" said the war correspondent, and then seeing his companion busy with his field glass he produced his own. "Where?" said the war correspondent, sweeping the enemy's lines. "It's nothing," said the young lieutenant, still looking. "What's nothing?" The young lieutenant put down his glass and pointed. "I thought I saw something there behind the stems of those trees, something black. What it was I don't know." The war correspondent tried to get even by intense scrutiny. "It wasn't anything," said the young lieutenant, rolling over to regard the darkling evening sky, and generalized, "There never will be anything any more forever, unless—" The war correspondent looked inquiry. "They may get their stomachs wrong or something, living without proper drains." A sound of bugles came from the tents behind. The war correspondent slid backward down the sand and stood up. Boom! Came from somewhere far away to the left. "Halloa!" he said, hesitated, and crawled back to peer again. "Firing at this time is jolly bad manners." The young lieutenant was incommunicative again for a space. Then he pointed to the distant clump of trees again. "One of our big guns. They were firing at that," he said. "The thing that wasn't anything. Something over there, anyhow." Both men were silent, peering through their glasses for a space. "Just when it's twilight," the lieutenant complained. He stood up. "I might stay here a bit," said the war correspondent. The lieutenant shook his head. "There is nothing to see," he apologized, and then went down to where his little squad of sun-brown, loose-limbed men had been yarning in the trench. The war correspondent stood up also, glanced for a moment at the business-like bustle below him, gave perhaps 20 seconds to those enigmatical trees again, then turned his face toward the camp. He found himself wondering whether his editor would consider the story of how somebody thought he saw something black behind a clump of trees, and how a gun was fired at this illusion by somebody else, too trivial for public consultation. "It's the only gleam of a shadow of interest," said the war correspondent, "for 10 whole days. No," he said presently, "I'll write that other article. Is war played out?" He surveyed the darkling lines in perspective, the tangle of trenches, one behind another, one commanding another, which the defender had made ready. The shadows and mists swallowed up their receding contours, and here and there a lantern gleamed, and here and there knots of men were busy about small fires. "No troops on earth could do it," he said. He was depressed. He believed that there were other things in life better worth having than proficiency in war. He believed that in the heart of civilization, for all its stresses, its crushing concentration of forces, its injustice and suffering, there lay something that might be the hope of the world. And the idea that any people, by living in the open air, hunting perpetually, losing touch with books and art and all the things that intensify life, might hope to resist and break that great development to the end of time, jarred on his civilized soul. Apt to this thought came a file of defender soldiers, and past him in the gleam of a swinging lamp that marked the way. He glanced at their red-lit faces, and one shone out for a moment, a common type of face in the defenders' ranks. Ill-shaped nose, sensuous lips, bright, clear eyes full of alert cunning, slouch hat cocked on one side and adorned with the peacock's plume of the rustic Don Juan turned soldier, a hard brown skin, a sinewy frame, an open, tireless stride, and a master's grip on the rifle. The war correspondent returned their salutations and went on his way. "Louts," he whispered, "cunning elementary louts. And they are going to beat the townsmen at the game of war." From the red glow among the nearer tents came first one and then half a dozen hearty voices, bawling in a drawling unison the words of a particularly slab and sentimental patriotic song. "Oh, go it," muttered the war correspondent bitterly. It was opposite the trenches called after Hackbone's hut that the battle began. There the ground stretched broad and level between the lines, with scarcely shelter for a lizard, and it seemed to the startled, just awakened men who came crowding into the trenches that this was one more proof of that green inexperience of the enemy of which they had heard so much. The war correspondent would not believe his ears at first, and swore that he and the war artist, who, still imperfectly roused, was trying to put on his boots by the light of a match held in his hand, were the victims of a common illusion. Then, after putting his head in a bucket of cold water, his intelligence came back as he towelled. He listened. "Gollies," he said, "that's something more than scare firing this time. It's like 10,000 carts on a bridge of tin." There came a sort of enrichment to that steady uproar. Machine guns! Then guns! The artist, with one boot on, thought to look at his watch, and went to it, hopping. "Half an hour from dawn," he said. "You were right about their attacking after all." The war correspondent came out of the tent, verifying the presence of chocolate in his pocket as he did so. He had to halt for a moment or so until his eyes were toned down to the night a little. "Pitch," he said. He stood for a space to season his eyes before he felt justified in striking out for a black gap among the adjacent tents. The artist, coming out behind him, fell over a tent rope. It was 2:30 in the morning of the darkest night in time, and against a sky of dull black silk the enemy was talking searchlights, a wild jabber of searchlights. "He's trying to blind our riflemen," said the war correspondent with a flash, and waited for the artist, and then set off with a sort of discreet haste again. "Whoa!" he said presently. "Ditches!" They stopped. "It's the confounded searchlights," said the war correspondent. They saw lanterns going to and fro nearby, and men falling in to march down to the trenches. They were for following them, and then the artist began to feel his night eyes. "If we scramble this," he said, "and it's only a drain, there's a clear run up to the ridge," and that way they took. Lights came and went in the tents behind as the men turned out, and ever and again they came to broken ground and staggered and stumbled, but in a little while they drew nearer the crest. Something that sounded like the impact of a very important railway accident happened in the air above them, and the shrapnel bullets seethed about them like a sudden handful of hail. "Right ho!" said the war correspondent, and soon they judged they had come to the crest, and stood in the midst of a world of great darkness and frantic glares, whose principal fact was sound. Right and left of them and all about them was the uproar, an army full of magazine fire, at first chaotic and monstrous, and then, eked out by little flashes and gleams and suggestions, taking the beginnings of a shape. It looked to the war correspondent as though the enemy must have attacked in line and with his whole force, in which case he was either being or was already annihilated. "Dawn and the dead," he said, with his instinct for headlines. He said this to himself, but afterwards, by means of shouting, he conveyed an idea to the artist. "They must have meant it for a surprise," he said. It was remarkable how the firing kept on. After a time he began to perceive a sort of rhythm in this inferno of noise. It would decline perceptibly, droop towards something that was comparatively a pause of inquiry. "Aren't you all dead yet?" this pause seemed to say. The flickering fringe of rifle flashes would become attenuated and broken, and the whack bang of the enemy's big guns 2 miles away there would come up out of the deeps. Then suddenly, east or west of them, something would startle the rifles to a frantic outbreak again. The war correspondent taxed his brain for some theory of conflict that would account for this, and was suddenly aware that the artist and he were vividly illuminated. He could see the ridge on which they stood, and before them, in black outline, a file of riflemen hurrying down towards the nearer trenches. It became visible that a light rain was falling, and farther away towards the enemy was a clear space with men running across it in disorder. He saw one of those men throw up his hands and drop. and something else, black and shining, loomed up on the edge of the beam coruscating flashes, and behind it and far away a calm white eye regarded the world. Whit, 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 sang something in the air, and then the artist was running for cover, with the war correspondent behind him. Bang came shrapnel, bursting close at hand as it seemed, and our two men were lying flat in a dip in the ground, and the light and everything had gone again, leaving a vast note of interrogation upon the night. The war correspondent came within bawling range. "What the deuce was it shooting our men down?" "Black," said the artist, "and like a fort. Not 200 yards from the first trench." He sought for comparisons in his mind. "Something between a big blockhouse and a giant's dish cover," he said. "And they were running," said the war correspondent. "You'd run if a thing like that, searchlight to help it, turned up like a prowling nightmare in the middle of the night." They crawled to what they judged the edge of the dip, and lay regarding the unfathomable dark. For a space they could distinguish nothing, and then a sudden convergence of the searchlights of both sides brought the strange thing out again. In that flickering pallor it had the effect of a large and clumsy black insect, an insect the size of an ironclad cruiser, crawling obliquely to the first line of trenches and firing shots out of portholes in its side. And on its carcass the bullets must have been battering with more than the passionate violence of hail on a roof of tin. Then, in the twinkling of an eye, the curtain of dark had fallen again, and the monster had vanished. But the crescendo of musketry marked its approach to the trenches. They were beginning to talk about the thing to each other when a flying bullet kicked dirt into the artist's face, and they decided abruptly to crawl down into the cover of the trenches. They had got down with an unobtrusive persistence into the second line before the dawn had grown clear enough for anything to be seen. They found themselves in a crowd of expectant riflemen, all noisily arguing about what would happen next. The enemy's contrivance had done execution upon the outlying men, it seemed, but they did not believe it would do any more. "Come the day and we'll capture the lot of them," said a burly soldier. "Them?" said the war correspondent. "They say there's a regular string of them crawling along the front of our lines. Who cares?" The darkness filtered away so imperceptibly that at no moment could one declare decisively that one could see. The searchlights ceased to sweep hither and thither. The enemy's monsters were dubious patches of darkness upon the dark, and then no longer dubious, and so they crept out into distinctness. The war correspondent, munching chocolate absent-mindedly, beheld at last a spacious picture of battle under the cheerless sky, whose central focus was an array of 14 or 15 huge, clumsy shapes, lying in perspective on the very edge of the first line of trenches, at intervals of perhaps 300 yards, and evidently firing down upon the crowded riflemen. They were so close in that the defenders' guns had ceased, and only the first line of trenches was in action. The second line commanded the first, and as the light grew the war correspondent could make out the riflemen who were fighting these monsters, crouched in knots and crowds behind the transverse banks that crossed the trenches against the eventuality of an enfilade. The trenches close to the big machines were empty, save for the crumpled suggestions of dead and wounded men. The defenders had been driven right and left as soon as the prow of this Land Ironclad had loomed up over the front of the trench. He produced his field glass, and was immediately a centre of inquiry from the soldiers about him. They wanted to look, they asked questions, and after he had announced that the men across the traverses seemed unable to advance or retreat, and were crouching under cover rather than fighting, he found it advisable to loan his glasses to a burly and incredulous corporal. He heard a strident voice and found a lean and sallow soldier at his back talking to the artist. "There's chaps down there caught," the man was saying. "If they retreat they've got to expose themselves, and the fire's too straight. They aren't firing much, but every shot's a hit." "Who?" "The chaps in that thing, the men who are coming up." "Coming up where?" "We're evacuating them trenches where we can. Our chaps are coming back up in the zigzags, no end of 'em hit. But when we get clear our turn'll come, rather. These things won't be able to cross a trench or get into it, and before they can get back our guns'll smash 'em up. Smash 'em up right, see?" A brightness came into his eyes. "Then we'll have a go at the beggar inside," he said. The war correspondent thought for a moment, trying to realize the idea. Then he set himself to recover his field glasses from the burly corporal. The daylight was getting clearer now, the clouds were lifting, and a gleam of lemon yellow amidst the level masses to the east portended sunrise. He looked again at the Land Ironclad, and he saw it in the bleak grey dawn lying obliquely upon the slope and on the very tip of the foremost trench. The suggestion of a stranded vessel was very great indeed. It might have been from 80 to 100 feet long. It was about 250 yards away. Its vertical side was 10 feet high or so, smooth for that height, and then with a complex patterning under the eaves of its flattish turtle cover. This patterning was a close interlacing of portholes, rifle barrels, and telescope tubes, sham and real, indistinguishable one from the other. The thing had come into such a position as to enfilade the trench, which was empty now, so far as he could see, except for 2 or 3 crouching knots of men and the tumbled dead. Behind it, across the plain, it had scored the grass with a train of linked impressions, like the dotted tracings sea things leave in sand. Left and right of that track, dead men and wounded men were scattered. Men it had picked off as they fled back from their advanced positions in the searchlight glare from the invaders' lines. And now it lay, with its head projecting a little over the trench it had won, as if it were a single sentient thing planning the next phase of its attack. He lowered his glasses and took a more comprehensive view of the situation. These creatures of the night had evidently won the first line of trenches, and the fight had come to a pause. In the increasing light he could make out by a stray shot or a chance exposure that the defenders' marksmen were lying thick in the second and third line of trenches towards the low crest of the position, and in such of the zigzags as gave them a chance of a converging fire. The men about him were talking of guns. "We're in the line of the big guns at the crest, but they'll soon shift one to pepper them," the lean man said reassuringly. "Whoop!" said the corporal. "Bang, bang, bang, whirr!" It was a sort of nervous jump, and all the rifles were going off by themselves. The war correspondent found himself and the artist, 2 idle men crouching behind a line of preoccupied backs of industrious men discharging magazines. The monster had moved. It continued to move, regardless of the hail that splashed its skin with bright new specks of lead. It was singing a mechanical ditty to itself. Tuff, 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 and squirting out little jets of steam behind. It had humped itself up as a limpet does before it crawls. It had lifted its skirt and displayed along the length of it feet. They were thick, stumpy feet, between knobs and buttons in shape, flat, broad things reminding one of the feet of elephants or the legs of caterpillars. And then, as the skirt rose higher, the war correspondent, scrutinizing the thing through his glasses again, saw that these feet hung, as it were, on the rims of wheels. His thoughts whirled back to Victoria Street, Westminster, and he saw himself in the piping times of peace seeking matter for an interview. Mr. Diplock, he said, and he called them pedrails. Fancy meeting them here. The marksman beside him raised his head and shoulders in a speculative mood to fire more certainly. It seemed so natural to assume the attention of the monster must be distracted by this trench before it, and was suddenly knocked backwards by a bullet through his neck. His feet flew up, and he vanished out of the margin of the watcher's field of vision. The war correspondent grovelled tighter, but after a glance behind him at a painful little confusion, he resumed his field glass, for the thing was putting down its feet one after the other, and hoisting itself farther and farther over the trench. Only a bullet in the head could have stopped him looking just then. The lean man with the strident voice ceased firing to turn and reiterate his point. "They can't possibly cross," he bawled. "They—" Bang, 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 drowned everything. The lean man continued speaking for a word or so, then gave it up, shook his head to enforce the impossibility of anything crossing a trench like the one below, and resumed business once more. And all the while that great bulk was crossing. When the war correspondent turned his glass on it again, it had bridged the trench, and its queer feet were rasping away at the farther bank in the attempt to get a hold there. It got its hold. It continued to crawl until the greater bulk of it was over the trench, until it was all over. Then it paused for a moment, adjusted its skirt a little nearer the ground, gave an unnerving toot toot, and came on abruptly at a pace of perhaps 6 miles an hour straight up the gentle slope towards our observer. The war correspondent raised himself on his elbow and looked a natural inquiry at the artist. For a moment the men about him stuck to their position and fired furiously. Then the lean man, in a mood of precipitancy, slid backwards, and the war correspondent said, "Come along," to the artist, and led the movement along the trench. As they dropped down, the vision of a hillside of trench being rushed by a dozen vast cockroaches disappeared for a space, and instead was one of a narrow passage crowded with men, for the most part receding, though one or two turned or halted. He never turned back to see the nose of the monster creep over the brow of the trench. He never even troubled to keep in touch with the artist. He heard the whit of bullets about him soon enough, and saw a man before him stumble and drop. And then he was one of a furious crowd fighting to get into a transverse zigzag ditch that enabled the defenders to get under cover up and down the hill. It was like a theatre panic. He gathered from signs and fragmentary words that on ahead another of these monsters had also won to the second trench. He lost his interest in the general course of the battle for a space altogether. He became simply a modest egotist in a mood of hasty circumspection, seeking the farthest rear amidst a dispersed multitude of disconcerted riflemen similarly employed. He scrambled down through the trenches, he took his courage in both hands and sprinted across the open. He had moments of panic when it seemed madness not to be quadrupedal, and moments of shame when he stood up and faced about to see how the fight was going. And he was one of many thousand very similar men that morning. On the ridge he halted in a knot of scrub, and was for a few minutes almost minded to stop and see things out. The day was now fully come. The grey sky had changed to blue, and of all the cloudy masses of the dawn there remained only a few patches of dissolving fleeciness. The world below was bright and singularly clear. The ridge was not, perhaps, more than 100 feet or so above the general plain, but in this flat region it sufficed to give the effect of extensive view. Away on the north side of the ridge, little and far, were the camps, the ordered wagons, all the gear of a big army, with officers galloping about and men doing aimless things. Here and there men were falling in, however, and the cavalry was forming up on the plain beyond the tents. The bulk of men who had been in the trenches were still on the move to the rear, scattered like sheep without a shepherd over the farthest slopes. Here and there were little rallies and attempts to wait and do something vague, but the general drift was away from any concentration. There on the southern side was the elaborate lacework of trenches and defences, across which these iron turtles, 14 of them spread out over a line of perhaps 3 miles, were now advancing as fast as a man could trot, and methodically shooting down and breaking up any persistent knots of resistance. Here and there stood little clumps of men, outflanked and unable to get away, showing the white flag, and the invaders' cyclist infantry was advancing now across the open, in open order but unmolested, to complete the work of the machines. Surveyed at large, the defenders already looked a beaten army, a mechanism that was effectually ironclad against bullets, that could at a pinch cross a 30-foot trench, and that seemed able to shoot out rifle bullets with unerring precision, was clearly an inevitable victor against anything but rivers, precipices, and guns. He looked at his watch. 4:30. Lord, what things can happen in 2 hours! Here's the whole blessed army being walked over, and at 2:30, and even now our blessed louts haven't done a thing with their guns. He scanned the ridge right and left of him with his glasses. He turned again to the nearest Land Ironclad, advancing now obliquely to him and not 300 yards away, and then scrambled the ground over which he must retreat if he was not to be captured. "They'll do nothing," he said, and glanced again at the enemy. And then from far away to the left came the thud of a gun, followed very rapidly by a rolling gunfire. He hesitated and decided to stay. The defender had relied chiefly upon his rifles in the event of an assault. His guns he kept concealed at various points upon and behind the ridge, ready to bring them into action against any artillery preparations for an attack on the part of his antagonist. The situation had rushed upon him with the dawn, and by the time the gunners had their guns ready for motion, the Land Ironclads were already in amongst the foremost trenches. There is a natural reluctance to fire into one's own broken men, and many of the guns, being intended simply to fight an advance of the enemy's artillery, were not in positions to hit anything in the second line of trenches. After that the advance of the Land Ironclads was swift. The Defender General found himself suddenly called upon to invent a new sort of warfare, in which guns were to fight alone amidst broken and retreating infantry. He had scarcely 30 minutes in which to think it out. He did not respond to the call, and what happened that morning was that the advance of the Land Ironclads forced the fight, and each gun and battery made what play its circumstances dictated. For the most part it was poor play. Some of the guns got in 2 or 3 shots, some 1 or 2, and the percentage of misses was unusually high. The howitzers, of course, did nothing. The Land Ironclads in each case followed much the same tactics. As soon as a gun came into play, the monster turned itself almost end on, so as to minimize the chances of a square hit, and made not for the gun, but for the nearest point on its flank from which the gunners could be shot down. Few of the hits scored were very effectual. Only one of the things was disabled, and that was the one that fought the 3 batteries attached to the brigade on the left wing. 3 that were hit when close upon the guns were clean shot through without being put out of action. Our war correspondent did not see that one momentary arrest of the tide of victory on the left. He saw only the very ineffectual fight of half battery 96B close at hand upon his right. This he watched some time beyond the margin of safety. Just after he heard the 3 batteries opening up upon his left, he became aware of the thud of horses' hoofs from the sheltered side of the slope, and presently saw first 1 and then 2 other guns galloping into position along the north side of the ridge, well out of sight of the great bulk that was now creeping obliquely towards the crest and cutting up the lingering infantry beside it and below as it came. The half battery swung round into line, each gun describing its curve, halted, unlimbered, and prepared for action. Bang! The Land Ironclad had become visible over the brow of the hill, and just visible as a long black back to the gunners. It halted as though it hesitated. The 2 remaining guns fired, and then their big antagonist had swung round and was in full view end on against the sky, coming at a rush. The gunners became frantic in their haste to fire again. They were so near the war correspondent could see the expressions on their excited faces through his field glass. As he looked, he saw a man drop, and realized for the first time that the Ironclad was shooting. For a moment the big black monster crawled with an accelerated pace towards the furiously active gunners. Then, as if moved by a generous impulse, it turned its full broadside to their attack, and scarcely 40 yards away from them. The war correspondent turned his field glass back to the gunners and perceived it was now shooting down the men about the guns with the most deadly rapidity. Just for a moment it seemed splendid, and then it seemed horrible. The gunners were dropping in heaps about their guns. To lay a hand on a gun was death. Bang! Went the gun on the left, a hopeless miss, and that was the only second shot the half battery fired. In another moment half a dozen surviving artillerymen were holding up their hands amidst a scattered muddle of dead and wounded men, and the fight was done. The war correspondent hesitated between stopping in his scrub and waiting for an opportunity to surrender decently, or taking to an adjacent gully he had discovered. If he surrendered, it was certain he would get no copy off, while if he escaped, there were all sorts of chances. He decided to follow the gully and take the first offer in the confusion beyond the camp of picking up a horse. Subsequent authorities have found fault with the first Land Ironclads in many particulars, but assuredly they served their purpose on the day of their appearance. They were essentially long, narrow, and very strong steel frameworks carrying the engines, and borne upon 8 pairs of big ped-rail wheels, each about 10 feet in diameter, each a driving wheel, and set upon long axles free to swivel round a common axis. This arrangement gave them the maximum of adaptability to the contours of the ground. They crawled level along the ground with one foot high upon a hillock and another deep in a depression, and they could hold themselves erect and steady sideways upon even a steep hillside. The engineers directed the engines under the command of the captain, who had look-out points at small ports all around the upper edge of the adjustable skirt of 12-inch iron plating, which protected the whole affair, and could also raise or depress a conning tower set about the portholes through the centre of the iron top cover. The riflemen each occupied a small cabin of peculiar construction, and these cabins were slung along the sides of and before and behind the great main framework, in a manner suggestive of the slinging of the seats of an Irish jaunting car. Their rifles, however, were very different pieces of apparatus from the simple mechanisms in the hands of their adversaries. These were in the first place automatic, ejected their cartridges and loaded again from a magazine each time they fired, until the ammunition store was at an end, and they had the most remarkable sights imaginable, sights which threw a bright little camera obscura picture into the light tight box in which the rifleman sat below. This camera obscura picture was marked with 2 crossed lines, and whatever was covered by the intersection of these 2 lines, that the rifle hit. The sighting was ingeniously contrived. The rifleman stood at the table with a thing like an elaboration of a draftsman's dividers in his hand, and he opened and closed these dividers so that they were always at the apparent height, if it was an ordinary-sized man, of the man he wanted to kill. A little twisted strand of wire like an electric light wire ran from this implement up to the gun, and as the dividers opened and shut the sights went up and down. Changes in the clearness of the atmosphere, due to changes of moisture, were met by an ingenious use of that meteorologically sensitive substance, catgut, and when the Land Ironclad moved forward the sights got a compensatory deflection in the direction of its motion. The rifleman stood up in his pitch-dark chamber and watched the little picture before him. One hand held the dividers for judging distance, and the other grasped a big knob like a door handle. As he pushed this knob about, the rifle swung to correspond, and the picture passed to and fro like an agitated panorama. When he saw a man he wanted to shoot, he brought him up to the cross lines, and then pressed a finger upon a little push like an electric bell push, conveniently placed in the centre of the knob. Then the man was shot. If by any chance the rifleman missed his target, he moved the knob a trifle or readjusted his dividers, pressed the push, and got him the second time. This rifle and its sights protruded from a porthole exactly like a great number of other portholes that ran in a triple row under the eaves of the cover of the Land Ironclad. Each porthole displayed a rifle and a sight in dummy, so that the real ones could only be hit by a chance shot, and if one was, then the young man below said pshaw, turned on an electric light, lowered the injured instrument into his camera, replaced the injured part, or put up a new rifle if the injury was considerable. You must conceive these cabins as hung clear above the swing of the axles, and inside the big wheels upon which the great elephant-like feet were hung, and behind these cabins, along the centre of the monster, ran a central gallery into which they opened, and along which worked the big compact engines. It was like a long passage into which this throbbing machinery had been packed, and the captain stood about the middle, close to the ladder that led to his conning tower, and directed the silent, alert engineers, for the most part by signs. The throb and noise of the engines mingled with the reports of rifles and the intermittent clangor of the bullet hail upon the armour. Ever and again he would touch the wheel that raised his conning tower, step up his ladder until his engineers could see nothing of him above the waist, and then come down again with orders. 2 small electric lights were all the illumination of this space. They were placed to make him most clearly visible to his subordinates. The air was thick with the smell of oil and petrol, and had the war correspondent been suddenly transferred from the spacious dawn outside to the bowels of the apparatus, he would have thought himself fallen into another world. The captain, of course, saw both sides of the battle. When he raised his head into the conning tower, there were the dewy sunrise, the amazed and disordered trenches, the flying and falling soldiers, the depressed-looking groups of prisoners, the beaten guns. When he bent down again to signal "half speed," "quarter speed," "half circle round towards the right," or what not, he was in the oil-smelling twilight of the ill-lit engine-room. Close beside him, on either side, was the mouthpiece of a speaking tube, and ever and again he would direct one side or the other of his strange craft to "concentrate fire forward on gunners," or to "clear out the trench about 100 yards on our right front." He was a young man, healthy enough but by no means sun-tanned, and of a type of feature and expression that prevails in His Majesty's Navy: alert, intelligent, quiet. He and his engineers and his riflemen all went about their work, calm and responsible men. They had none of that flapping strenuousness of the half-wit in a hurry, that excessive strain upon the blood vessels, that hysteria of effort which is so frequently regarded as the proper state of mind for heroic deeds. If their machine had demanded anything of the sort, they would, of course, have improved their machine. They were all perfectly sober and in good training, and if any of them had begun to ejaculate nonsense or bawl patriotic airs, the others would probably have gagged him up as a dangerous, unnerving sort of fool. And if they were free from hysteria, they were equally free from that stupid affectation of nonchalance which is the refuge of the thoroughly incapable in danger. Death was abroad, and there were marginal possibilities of the unforeseen. But it is no good calculating upon the incalculable, and so, beyond a certain unavoidable tightening up of nerve and muscle, a certain firmness of the lips, this affected them not at all. For the enemy these young engineers were defeating they felt a certain qualified pity, and a quite unqualified contempt. They regarded these big healthy men they were shooting down precisely as these same big healthy men might regard some inferior kind of nigger. They despised them for making war, despised their bawling patriotisms and their emotionality profoundly, despised them above all for the petty cunning and the almost brutish want of imagination their method of fighting displayed. If they must make war, these young men thought, why in thunder don't they do it like sensible men? They resented the assumption that their own side was too stupid to do anything more than play their enemy's game, that they were going to play this costly folly according to the rules of unimaginative men. They resented being forced to the trouble of making man-killing machinery, resented the alternative of having to massacre these people or endure their truculent yappings, resented the whole unfathomable imbecility of war. Meanwhile, with something of the mechanical precision of a good clerk posting a ledger, the riflemen moved their knobs and pressed their buttons. The captain of Land Ironclad No. 3 had halted on the crest close to his captured half-battery. His lined-up prisoners stood hard by and waited for the cyclists behind to come for them. He surveyed the victorious morning through his conning tower. He read the general's signals. 5 and forward to keep among the guns to the left and prevent any attempt to recover them. 7 and 11 and 12, stick to the guns you have got. 7, get into position to command the guns taken by 3. Then we're to do something else, are we? 6 and 1, quicken up to about 10 miles an hour and walk round behind that camp to the levels near the river. We shall bag the whole crowd of them, interjected the young man. Ah, here we are. 2 and 3, 8 and 9, 13 and 14, space out to 1,000 yards, wait for the word, and then go slowly to cover the advance of the cyclist infantry against any charge of mounted troops. That's all right, but where's 10? Halloa? 10 to repair and get movable as soon as possible. They've broken up 10. The discipline of the new war machines was businesslike rather than pedantic, and the head of the captain came down out of the conning tower to tell his men. I say, you chaps there, they've broken up 10. Not badly, I think, but anyhow he's stuck. But that still left 13 of the monsters in action to finish up the broken army. The war correspondent, stealing down his gully, looked back and saw them all lying along the crest and talking fluttering congratulatory flags to one another. Their iron sides were shining golden in the light of the rising sun. The private adventures of the war correspondent terminated in surrender about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and by that time he had stolen a horse, pitched off it, and narrowly escaped being rolled upon, found the brute had broken its leg, and shot it with his revolver. He had spent some hours in the company of a squad of dispirited riflemen who had commandeered his field glass, and whose pedestrianism was exemplary, and he had quarrelled with them about topography at last, and gone off by himself in a direction that should have brought him to the banks of the river, and didn't. Moreover, he had eaten all his chocolate, and found nothing in the whole world to drink. Also, it had become extremely hot. From behind a broken but attractive stone wall he had seen far away in the distance the defender horsemen trying to charge cyclists in open order, with Land Ironclads outflanking them on either side. He had discovered that cyclists could retreat over open turf before horsemen, with a sufficient margin of speed to allow of frequent dismounts and much terribly effective sharpshooting. And he had a sufficient persuasion that those horsemen, having charged their hearts out, had halted just beyond his range of vision and surrendered. He had been urged to sudden activity by a forward movement of one of those machines that had threatened to enfilade his wall. He had discovered a fearful blister on his heel. He was now in a scrubby, gravelly place, sitting down and meditating on his pocket handkerchief, which had in some extraordinary way become in the last 24 hours extremely ambiguous in hue. "It's the whitest thing I've got," he said. He had known all along that the enemy was east, west, and south of him, but when he heard Ironclads numbers 1 and 6 talking in their measured, deadly way not half a mile to the north, he decided to make his own little unconditional peace without any further risks. He was for hoisting his white flag to a bush and taking up a position of modest obscurity near it, until someone came along. He became aware of voices, clatter, and the distinctive noises of a body of horse quite near, and he put his handkerchief in his pocket again, and went to see what was going forward. The sound of firing ceased, and then as he drew near he heard the deep sounds of many simple, coarse, but hearty and noble-hearted soldiers of the old school swearing with vigour. He emerged from his scrub upon a big level plain, and far away a fringe of trees marked the banks of the river. In the centre of this picture was a still intact road bridge, and a big railway bridge a little to the right. 2 Land Ironclads rested with a general air of being long, harmless sheds, in a pose of anticipatory peacefulness right and left of the picture, completely commanding 2 miles and more of the river levels. Emerged and halted a few yards from the scrub was the remainder of the defenders' cavalry, dusty, a little disordered, and obviously annoyed, but still a very fine show of men. In the middle distance 3 or 4 men and horses were receiving medical attendance, and nearer a knot of officers regarded the distant novelties in mechanism with profound distaste. Everyone was very distinctly aware of the 12 other ironclads, and of the multitude of townsmen soldiers on bicycles or afoot, encumbered now by prisoners and captured war gear, but otherwise thoroughly effective, who were sweeping like a great net in their rear. "Checkmate," said the war correspondent, walking out into the open, "but I surrender in the best of company. 24 hours ago I thought war was impossible, and these beggars have captured the whole blessed army. Well, well!" He thought of his talk with the young lieutenant. If there's no end to the surprises of science, the civilized people have it, of course. As long as their science keeps going, they will necessarily be ahead of open country men. Still, he wondered for a space what might have happened to the young lieutenant. The war correspondent was one of those inconsistent people who always want the beaten side to win. When he saw all these burly, sun-tanned horsemen disarmed and dismounted and lined up, when he saw their horses unskilfully led away by the singularly not equestrian cyclists to whom they had surrendered, when he saw these truncated paladins watching this scandalous sight, he forgot altogether that he had called these men cunning louts, and wished them beaten not 24 hours ago. A month ago he had seen that regiment in its pride going forth to war, and had been told of its terrible prowess, how it could charge in open order with each man firing from his saddle, and sweep before it anything else that ever came out to battle in any sort of order, foot or horse, and it had had to fight a few score of young men in atrociously unfair machines. Manhood versus machinery occurred to him as a suitable headline. Journalism curdles all one's mind to phrases. He strolled as near the lined-up prisoners as the sentinels seemed disposed to permit, and surveyed them and compared their sturdy proportions with those of their lightly built captors. "Smart degenerates," he muttered. "Anemic cockneydom." The surrendered officers came quite close to him presently, and he could hear the colonel's high-pitched tenor. The poor gentleman had spent 3 years of arduous toil upon the best material in the world, perfecting that shooting from the saddle charge, and he was mourning with phrases of blasphemy, natural under the circumstances, what one could be expected to do against this suitably consigned ironmongery. "Guns," said someone. "Big guns they can walk round. You can't shift big guns to keep pace with them, and little guns in the open they rush. I saw 'em rushed. You might do a surprise now and then. Assassinate the brutes, perhaps. You might make things like 'em. What? More ironmongery? Us? I'll call my article," meditated the war correspondent, "Mankind versus Ironmongery, and quote the old boy at the beginning." And he was much too good a journalist to spoil his contrast by remarking that the half-dozen comparatively slender young men in blue pyjamas, who were standing about their victorious Land Ironclad, drinking coffee and eating biscuits, had also in their eyes and carriage something not altogether degraded below the level of a man. End of The Land Ironclads by H.G. Wells. Recording by Andy Sames.
The Unwilling Professor by Arthur Porges. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars, Rolander. The Unwilling Professor by Arthur Porges. On that fateful afternoon Fatty Schultz and Irv Lees had cut their last classes and were taking a gloomy walk together, scrambling through the scrubby brush well behind the athletic field. There were good reasons for their unhappiness. Fatty was failing in calculus 2 with a velocity that varied directly as the square of the number of lectures attended. Irv's math instructor had informed him with a kind of loathing respect that his only salvation lay in recommencing the study of arithmetic, taking 5 or 10 years in the process, and then retiring to a cave for perhaps another 15 in the vain hope of digesting, through meditation and prayer, the multiplication table. After that Irv might be ready for elementary algebra, but not, the professor hoped to a merciful God, in this unfortunate institution of higher learning. As a matter of fact, the whole of their fraternity, Omega Pi Upsilon, usually referred to on campus as O.P.U., was in the same boat regarding almost every subject offered at Bateman College. Bateman had courses that ranged from aardvark breeding to Scythum brewing, but no field of knowledge troubled them more than mathematics. Hence the long face on Irv Lee's. Fatty's visage also strove to elongate, but simply wasn't built for such an accomplishment. Instead, his piggy little eyes, ordinarily glowing with a kind of coarse good humour, were now smouldering with resentment. They had just seated themselves in a small clearing, where Fatty, after setting his calculus text on a grassy mound, began to heave rocks at it, when there was a whistling scream, a jarring whump, and before their bulging eyes a small disk lay crumpled barely 10 yards away. A shrill creaking came from this odd craft, which looked like a manhole cover, some 8 feet in diameter and 20 inches thick. Then, as they stared in wonder, a badly sprung port opened crazily, and a small rabbit flopped out. It may be stated here that the creature was not actually a rabbit, but that any difference between the disk's pilot and an ordinary cottontail was imperceptible to the naked eye. For a moment the rabbit swayed drunkenly, its big eyes cloudy. Then it hopped towards Fatty, preferring perhaps his larger gravitational field over Irv's. Extending one snowy paw, it squeaked, "Good afternoon, gentlemen. Permit me to introduce myself. I'm a goodwill ambassador from Venus, and by your conventions should be addressed as Professor. My name," he added a trifle pompously, "is Iglout P. Schlakmak, and I hold degrees comparable to your Ph.D., LL.D., and M.D." All this in a very British accent. Fatty gave a hoarse croak. Irv's knees knocked together. "Come," the rabbit chirped. "Chin up, fellows. There's nothing to be afraid of. I speak English because we've been monitoring your radio broadcasts for years. Television is a bit trickier, but we've seen a few. And by listening to educational programs, I've learned a great deal about terrestrial culture, which I notice is based upon cigarettes, used cars. But never mind that now. I must get to Washington and present myself. A rival of mine is about to contact Mars for the first time, and I hope to send in my report on Earth first." He peered at them anxiously. "You do understand me, chaps, don't you? I learned the best English from BBC, you know." Seeing that the two boys were still dumb, the rabbit with a mighty effort picked up the 3-pound calculus text, which was bound in a revolting green. As he did so, paper fluttered out, and the professor deftly scooped it up. He studied Fatty's messy scrawlings for a moment, then said warmly, "Ah, I observe that you chaps are beginning the study of elementary mathematics." He shook a paw waggishly. "The limits are wrong on this integration. They should go from p/2 to p/3 first, instead of to 0. There is a discontinuity at p/3, and you result that the center of gravity of this 6-inch cube is 9 feet to the right looks somewhat implausible." At this Fatty finally found his voice. Discontinuity?" he gulped. "What's that?" "Oh, you know," Irv rebuked him. "Old Cusp's been gassing about 'em for days now." "Has he? Well, what is it, if you're so smart?" "I don't remember," Irv said brazenly, "but at least I heard the name before." "At p/3," the rabbit broke in with authority, "the denominator of the integrand vanishes. To put it loosely, the function becomes infinite." Fatty looked at Irv. Irv gaped at Fatty. The piggy eyes lit up. "A rabbit that knows math!" Fatty breathed. "Knows it! He wrote the damned book. A real brain!" Irv exulted. Once again their eyes met meaningly. "You always said," Irv remarked in an abstracted manner, "that you could lick the guy who invented calc." "I sure can," Fatty asserted. "But—" He paused, then, with a speed surprising in one of his bulk, his thick hands shot out, and Professor Schlakmak, the eminent Venusian savant, found himself dangling by the ears from stubby, freckled fingers. He kicked with a vigor shockingly undignified. "Let me down!" he squeaked furiously. "This is outrageous. A friendly ambassador's person is sacred among all civilized peoples. Your national president shall hear of this insult." Fatty looked at him, showing uneven teeth in a loose grin. "Bugs Bunny," he gloated, "you are now the official mascot of Omega Pi Upsilon." "I second the motion," Irv said, shuffling in excitement. "We'd better hide his ship, though," Fatty cried, full of ingenious intelligence, now that nobody was grading him for it. "It's too big, ain't it?" Irv replied doubtfully. "Simmer down, you," he ordered the writhing professor. "We don't want to choke you, but—" The captive subsided, contenting himself with little quivers of indignation. "It's awful light," Fatty muttered, showing the damaged saucer with one size 11 shoe. "We'll move it over here, pile a lot of brush on top, and—" "Start a fire," Irv interrupted joyously. The professor gave a piercing squeal of protest. "No, stupid," Fatty told him, winking. "If the prof here helps us out this semester, we'll give him back his old disc, right?" "Right," Irv agreed, crossing two fingers. In 15 minutes, even with Fatty working one-handed, the ship vanished under a pile of stiff brush. "That's that," Irv said, taking a deep breath. "Now—" "We can't take him like this," Fatty remarked, swinging the professor by his ears and giving him a shake by way of emphasis. "Why not? We just been rabbit hunting, that's all." "Too risky. Even if the professor keeps quiet, some joker from another frat might get nosy." "He'll be quiet," Irv said grimly. "I know how to hit a rabbit on the neck with the edge of my hand." Here the professor began to kick frantically, and Fatty snatched his hind legs, holding him rigid from ears to toes. "There's an old cardboard box back there," Fatty said. "That'll do the trick." A few seconds later the sullen captive was stuffed unceremoniously into a damp, mouldy container, and the two students returned to the campus, their hearts free from mathematical worries. "The frat will owe us plenty for this," Fatty said darkly. "We've never had anybody to coach us in math." "They'll be licking our boots," Irv agreed. "But they always have, the poor dopes." That night the professor, poorly refreshed by some wilted carrot tops and water, found himself in a circle of eager Omega Pi Upsilons delivering a detailed lecture, mostly problem-solving, on Section 45 of Bruta's Introduction to the Elementary Rudiments of the Differential and Integral Calculus. He was a good teacher, and when either his enthusiasm or expository art faltered, Fatty revived it quickly with a sharp pinch or stinging slap. So, although the average IQ of the fraternity was 76, a certain amount of mathematics got through, and it was almost midnight before the unhappy ambassador found himself lying in a dirty, fetid cage, formerly the residence of the fraternity parrot, who had expired for lack of intelligent dialogue to copy. Rabbits, even Venusian ones, cannot weep, but the professor's soul was heavy within him. And so it went, day after day, week after week. "I am quite amazed," Professor Cusp told a skeptical colleague towards the end of the term, "at the remarkable way Schultz and his OPU bunch have improved. Their homework these last 6 weeks has been excellent." "Somebody's coaching them, or doing it outright," was the cynical reply. "I find no improvement in their zoology." "No, that's what I suspected at first. But it can't be true. For example, on last week's extra credit program, a real stinker, they turned in over a dozen correct solutions, all different. Nobody would go to that much trouble for the PU crowd. They're about as popular on campus as Malankov is with the DAR." Another colleague who had been listening demanded, "But you won't let Fatty Schultz by, will you?" "I'll have to," Cusp admitted. "Even though his exams are still horrible, I give quite a bit of weight to good homework, so—" "You swine!" the other said sourly. Now I'll get him. Casp laughed. Ah, but you're supposed to be tough. They're afraid of you. They'd better be. It's a pity the biology lab has to experiment on poor chimps while we give degrees to anthropoids like Fatty. That night Fatty told his unwilling mascot the bad news. "I'm sorry, Prof," he said genially. "It's only one more term, then I'll be done with math, and you can go back to your disk. But my last course is with old Totjent, and he's rough." "You promised," the professor squealed angrily. "This time I mean it, honest." "Hey, Fatty," a fraternity brother objected. "Ain't you gonna leave the prof to our gang, just 'cause you're through?" He broke off in confusion as Irv kicked his ankle hard. "Ignore the jerk," Lise reassured the crestfallen rabbit. "When Fatty and I finish our math requirement, you're on your own again. Course you'll have to promise not to tell the president." Over the professor's head he winked broadly at his friends. "I won't do it. It's a cad's trick." The rabbit's brown eyes were bright with rage. Fatty pawed his soft fur with one lardy hand. "Come on, Prof, be a sport," he urged, greasily affectionate. "We like you a lot. You wouldn't let us down now." "I will not do it. You promised." "You will, too," Irv grunted. "Don't give us any back talk. If I have to twist your ears." "Use the cigarette lighter," somebody suggested, half ashamed. "He's only bluffing again." "I'm not," the professor said sturdily. "You can burn me, kill me, but I won't tutor this bunch of cretins any more." "Where does he get those words?" a student wondered aloud. "What's a cretin?" "Irv," Fatty said in a sly, buttery voice, "where's that nasty pooch who adopted the Delts last week? The one that chased the chaplain into Tom Paine Hall. I'll bet he's a first-class arbitrary day." "Mac," Irv addressed a slender, dark boy. "They keep him in that shed by the athletic field. Go and borrow him, will you?" Mac left. "What's an arbitrary day?" the professor quavered. "You'll find out," Fatty told him grimly. "Don't they teach pig Latin on Venus?" There was a strained silence, while some members of the group whispered protests, but there was no open resistance. Fatty and Irv ran Omega Phi Upsilon with an iron hand. Then the door opened, and Mac, tugging hard at the collar of a large dog, lurched into the room. "Here's Hotspur," he grinned as the brute strove to mangle the cowering professor. Hotspur was a canine melting pot. The Spitz in his ancestry seemed to predominate, but there were plain traces of Airedale, Setter, and crowning evidence of some misalliance Dachshund. White teeth bared in a slavering snarl, the dog glared at the rabbit, lunging against his collar as Mac held hard. But the professor had collapsed, all his courage gone. "A dog!" he gasped in horror, and Hotspur seemed startled at the human voice emerging from the rabbit. A thin whimper came from the professor. "Take that monster away," he begged. "I'll do anything, anything." "That's better," Fatty chortled. "But we need this good old hound more than the Delts do. Put him down in the basement, just in case." He eyed the professor, who shrank into a furry, abject heap. "My new prof, Dr. Totjent, is tough," Fatty said. "Bugs Bunny here is gonna have plenty to do. We'll clear out now and let him prepare his assignments. See that you watch those signs." He jibed, handing out what he had so long received. He fastened the rabbit's chains to its stout staple in the wall. "Here." He fished an apple core from his jeans and tossed it at the professor, giving him an oily smirk. "Just to show there's no hard feeling. Eat hearty." He stumped out, followed by his companions. Gradually it grew dark, and the deserted fraternity house was quiet. Ravenous, the professor finally nerved himself to nibble the apple core, which to his sensitive nostrils reeked of Fatty. He had just downed the last noisome fragment when there was a loud, inquisitive sniff at the door. He grew rigid, Another sniff and the shoulder thrust of a heavy body. Insecurely shut, the door swung open and a huge white form stalked in. The professor cringed, moaning a little, the hot alien scent of dog in his nose, prepared to meet a terrible death. "St!" the big mongrel admonished him. "I'm a friend," he rumbled in slow, thick English. Trotting over, he took the slender chain in his great teeth and threw his 30-pound body into the wrench. The staple pulled free. "Let's get the hell out of here," he grunted, "while your bunch is gone." "But my ship," the professor stammered, staring in bewilderment. "It's broken down, and those two awful boys will find me before I can fix it." "Never mind, I'll give you a lift in mine. I'm heading for Washington. Then I'll have to report back on Mars. I can drop you either place. I just got word myself only a few days ago that our two planets had finally made contact. They asked me to find out where you disappeared to, but I never dreamed you were here when I heard you talking English. But we'd better scoot. I've spied out this place long enough. I don't think it's quite representative." They had just reached the brush behind the library, where the professor's passionate story was completed, when Hotspur, looking back, saw lights flash in the fraternity house windows. "Wait here," he said cryptically. "Be right back." He sprang into the brush and vanished. A few moments later, the anxious professor heard some yells of agony coming from the campus, and before long Hotspur returned panting. "I know you'll get a sympathetic hearing in Washington," he gasped. "And we Martians abhor violence, but there are times." He rubbed one paw against his mouth. "I didn't like the taste of herb, but fat is even worse. I hope," he added viciously, "they have to take Pasteur treatments." "Me too," Professor Schlackmack agreed cheerfully. "And best of all, they'll flunk math. But good. Where's your ship, pal?" End of The Unwilling Professor by Arthur Porges. Read by Lars, Rolander.
Think Yourself to Death, A Johnny Mayhem Adventure by C.H. Thames. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark Nelson. Think Yourself to Death, A Johnny Mayhem Adventure by C.H. Thames. Side note: if you've never read a Johnny Mayhem story before, you are in for a treat. Johnny, who wears different bodies the way ordinary people wear clothes, is one of the most fascinating series characters in science fiction. When he reached Ophiuchus, Johnny Mayhem was wearing the body of an elderly Syrian gentleman. Nothing could have been more incongruous. The Syrian wore a pince-nez, a dignified two-piece jumper in a charcoal color, sedate two-tone boots, and a black string tie. The loiterers in the street near the Galactic Observer's building looked and pointed and laughed. Using the dignity of the dead Syrian, whose body he wore like other people wear clothing, Johnny Mayhem ignored them. They had a point, of course. It was hot and humid on Ophiuchus 9. The loiterers in the dusty, evil-smelling streets wore nothing but loincloths. Mayhem went inside the building, which was air-conditioned. Probably it was the only air-conditioned structure on the entire planet. Mayhem dabbed at his Syrian forehead gratefully, mopping at sweat. As near as he could figure, his life expectancy in this body was down to 3 days, Earth-style. He wondered fleetingly why the Galactic League had sent him here to Ophiuchus. He shrugged, knowing he would find out soon enough. The Galactic Observer on Ophiuchus 9, a middle-aged Indian from Bombay named Govindaswamy, wore an immaculate white linen loincloth on his plump body and a relieved smile on his worried face when Mayhem entered his office. The two men shook hands. "So, you're Mayhem," Govindaswamy said in English. "They told me to expect you, sir. Pardon my staring, but I've never been face-to-face with a legend before. I'm impressed." Mayhem laughed. "You'll get over it." "Well, at least as a Syrian gentleman, you're not very prepossessing. That helps." "It wasn't my idea. It never is." I know that, sir." Covandaswamy got up nervously from his desk and paced across the room. "Do you know anything about Ophiuchus 9, Mayhem?" "Not much. It's one of the Forgotten Worlds, isn't it?" "Precisely, sir. Ophiuchus 9 is one of scores of interstellar worlds colonized in the first great outflux from Earth." "You mean during the population pressure of the 24th century?" "Exactly. Then Ophiuchus 9, like the other Forgotten Worlds, was all but forgotten. As you know, Mayhem, the first flux of colonization receded like a wave, inertia set in, and the so-called Forgotten Worlds became isolated from the rest of the galaxy for generations. Only in the past 50 years are we finding them again, one by one. Ophiuchus 9 is typical, isolated from the galaxy at large by a dust cloud that— "I know. I came through it." "It was colonized originally with Indians from southern and eastern India on Earth. That's why the Galactic League appointed me observer. I'm an Indian. These people, well, they're what my people might have developed into if they lived for hundreds of years in perfect isolation." "What's the trouble?" Covandaswamy answered with a question of his own. "You are aware of the Galactic League's chief aim?" "Sure. To see that no outworld, however small or distant, is left in isolation. Is that what you mean?" "Yes," agreed Covandaswamy. "The reason is obvious. For almost 1,000 years now, the human race has outpaced its social and moral development with development in the physical sciences. For almost 1,000 years, mankind has had the power to destroy itself. In isolation, this is possible. With mutual interchange of ideas, it is extremely unlikely. Thus, in the interests of human survival, the Galactic League tries to thwart isolated development. So far, the Forgotten Worlds have cooperated, but Ophiuchus 9 is an exception." "And the League wants me to find out why?" "Precisely." "How are they thwarting—" Covandaswamy was sweating despite the air conditioning, despite his almost naked state. "You have the right to turn this mission down, of course. The League told me that." "I'm here," Mayhem said simply. "Very well, sir. Sooner or later, every outworlder who ventures out among the Ophiuchans kills himself." "I guess I didn't hear you. Did you say kills himself?" "Suicide, Mayhem. Exactly." "But how can you blame—" "Like their ancestors from the Earthian subcontinent of India, Mayhem, the Ophiuchans are mystics. The trance, the holy man who sits in contemplation of his navel, the world spirit, these are the things of their culture most important to them. Mayhem, did you ever see 100 holy men of India working together?" "Usually they don't work together." "Precisely, sir. Precisely. Here, on Ophiuchus, they do. And not merely 100. All of them. Virtually all of them. Working together. Their minds in trance, unified. Seeking their world spirit, they can do amazing things." "Like mentally forcing the Outworlders to kill themselves?" "Yes, sir. Legally, they are innocent. Morally, they do not recognize the Outworlders as equals of themselves. The League wants to know what they are trying to hide. It could be a threat to peace and existence." "You have a body for me?" Johnny would be ready with that provided. If anyone but Johnny Mayhem had asked that question, Covandaswamy would not have known what he was talking about, or would have thought him insane, or both. But Johnny Mayhem was, of course, the legendary Man Without a Body. How many corporeal shells had he inhabited in the past half-dozen years? He shrugged, not remembering. He couldn't remain in one body more than a month. It would mean the final death of his elan, his bodiless sentience. So far, he had avoided that death. The Galactic League would help him if it could. Every world which had a human population and a Galactic League post, however small, must have a body in cold storage, waiting for Johnny Mayhem if his services were required. But no one knew exactly under what circumstances the Galactic League Council, operating from the hub of the galaxy, might summon Mayhem. And only a very few people, including those at the hub and the Galactic League First Men on civilized worlds and observers on primitive worlds, knew the precise mechanism of Mayhem's coming. To others, it was a weird mystery. Johnny Mayhem, bodiless sentience. Mayhem, Johnny Marlowe then, who had been chased from Earth, a pariah and a criminal almost 7 years ago, who had been mortally wounded on a wild planet deep within the Sagittarian swarm, whose life had been saved, after a fashion, by the white magic of the planet. Mayhem, doomed now to possible immortality as a bodiless sentience, an Elan, which could copy and activate a fresh corpse or one which had been frozen properly. An Elan doomed to wander eternally because it could not remain in one body for more than a month without body and Elan perishing. Mayhem, who had dedicated his strange, lonely life to the service of the Galactic League, because a normal life and normal social relations were not possible for him. "Then you'll do it?" Govindaswamy asked on Ophiuchus 9. "Even though you realize we can give you no official help, not only because the Galactic League approves of your work unofficially, but can't sanction it officially, but because an Outworlder can't set foot outside this building for long or off the space field without risking death." "By suicide?" "Yes, I'm practically a prisoner in Galactic League headquarters, as is my staff. You see—" "What about the body?" Govindaswamy looked at him nervously. "A native, Mayhem. A native won't be molested, you see." "That figures. What kind of native?" "In top shape, sir. Healthy, young, in the prime of life, you might say." "Then what's bothering you?" Nothing, sir." "Your technicians are ready?" "Yes, sir, and vowed to secrecy." Mayhem found a tiny capsule in the pocket of his Syrian jumper and popped it in his mouth. What's that?" Govindaswamy asked. Mayhem swallowed. "Curare," he said. "Curare? A poison." "Paralysis," said Mayhem quickly. "Muscular paralysis. You die because you stop breathing. Painless, and... But call your technicians. New body. Ready." Gasping, the Syrian gentleman, hardly Johnny Mayhem now, fell to the floor. Trembling, Govindaswamy pressed a button on his desk. A few moments later, 2 white-coated technicians entered the office. "Project M," Govindaswamy said. Grimly, the technicians went to work. Mayhem awoke. Ordinarily, it was his Elan alone which journeyed between the worlds, his Elan which was fed the information it would need in hypno-sleep while the frozen body was thawed out. Sometimes, however, he came the normal way in a body which still had some of its 30 days left, as he had come to Ophiuchus 9 in the Syrian gentleman. Darkness. The body felt young and healthy. Mayhem wondered vaguely how it had died, then decided it did not really matter. For the next 30 days the body would live again as Johnny Mayhem. Recessed lighting glowed at the juncture of walls and ceiling. Mayhem was reclining on a cot. A loincloth and a large shawl had been laid out for him. On the far wall of the room was a tinted mirror. Mayhem got up and went over there. What his new body looked like hardly mattered, he told himself. Youth, health, strength, these were important. He could sense them internally. He stared at the image in the mirror. His face turned beet red. He went for the shawl and the loincloth and put them on. Cursing, he went to find Govindaswamy. "Is this supposed to be a joke?" Mayhem demanded. "You never asked what the—" Govindaswamy began. "How am I supposed to find out anything like this?" "It's a young body, a healthy body. It is also the one we were given when the Galactic League first came here. It is the only one we were given." "Take it or leave it, eh?" "I'm afraid so, Mayhem." All right, I guess I shouldn't complain. It could probably outrun and outfight and outthink the dyspeptic old Syrian gentleman, and things turned out well enough on Sirius 3. But it'll probably take most of my time just getting used to it, Govindaswamy. I'm supposed to be conducting an investigation. At least, as an Ophiucan, you won't arouse suspicion. Mayhem nodded slowly, with reluctance. There was nothing else to say. He shook hands with Govindaswamy and, wearing the loincloth and the shawl, left the Galactic League building. With, of course, a completely new identity. Mayhem walked a mile and a half through hot, arid country. The League building was isolated, as if its inmates might contaminate the native Ophiucans. Along the dusty road, Mayhem passed a guru, the name for a wise man or a holy man first in India and now here on Ophiuchus 9. The guru sat in contemplation of the tip of his nose, legs crossed, soles of feet up, eyes half closed. The guru remained that way without moving until Mayhem was out of sight. Then the guru behaved in a very un-guru-like manner. The guru got up quite nimbly, joints creaking, skin dry and cracked. 3 strides brought him to a tree with a partly hollow trunk. He lifted a radio transmitter and began to talk. In 20 generations, the initially small population of Ophiuchus 9, all colonists from India on Earth, had increased geometrically. The colonized planet now was as overpopulated as the teeming subcontinent which long ago had sent the colonists seeking a new home. As a result, unemployment was chronic, discontent widespread, and whatever inner serenity mysticism might bring was widely sought after. This did not stop the non-mystics, however, of whom there were many, from seeking jobs that could pay money that could fill empty bellies. A long line gathered outside the employment office of Denebian Exports the morning after Mayhem had left the League building in his new body. Denebian Exports was the largest outworld company currently on Ophiuchus, a company which had solved the outworlder suicide problem quite simply by hiring no one but natives. Still, hoots and catcalls surrounded those on the employment line. Other jobless Ophiucans, apparently preferring near starvation to working for the Outworlders, threatened to make the situation dangerous. Pandit Gandhi Menon, a lean, handsome Ophiucan of perhaps 30 years, wished there was some way he could shut his ears to the abuse. He needed work. His father and mother were ill, his child was starving, his wife already dead. The gurus offered their own unique solution, of course. The body is nothing, they said. The mind is everything. But thus had the gurus spoken for 4,000 years, on Earth and on Ophiuchus. The great majority of Ophiucans, Pandit Gandhi Menon included, preferred food for the body to food for mystic thought. Still, the crowds were ugly, threatening to break up the line of job seekers if Denebian Exports didn't open its doors soon. An unkempt little man, not old but with a matted growth of beard, an unwashed body which gave the impression of wiry strength, and wild eyes, abruptly flung himself at the young woman in line in front of Pandit. Shouting, "Not our women too!" the little man attacked the girl, trying to drag her from the line. "It is bad enough our men, but not our women!" Pandit caught the fanatic's wiry arm and brought it behind his scrawny back in a hammerlock. "Leave her alone," he said. "If you try that again, I'll break your arm." The fanatic looked at Pandit with hate in his eyes, but stepped back and stood to one side mouthing invective. The girl, who was about 25 years old, had a livid mark on her arm. She wore a loincloth and shawl, the usual garb. She was, Pandit observed for the first time, quite pretty. "Thank you," she said. I'm not sure I'd like working for the Outworlders, but I need the money." "Don't we all?" Pandit told her. "But we're not hired yet. I am Pandit Gandhi Menon." "Sri Krishna," the girl said, smiling at him. "What sort of work is it?" Don't you know Sri Krishna? The girl shook her head, and Pandit said, Actually, I guess I don't know either. But there are rumors the Outworlders want jet pilots. Not for rocketry, for jets. To fly to the empty places. The empty places? Why? Pandit shrugged. Because they are empty, perhaps. Because they are too dry and too arid to support life. Because the Nebian export can claim whatever it found there for free export. So go the rumors. But surely you can't pilot a jet. Can you? Yes, Pandit said promptly with a faint show of pride. My father taught me. I want to thank you for what? Nothing. Anyone in my position would have done it. This rabble. The rabble was still noisy. Occasionally they hurled offal at the stragglers joining the rear of the long line. But Pandit and Sri Krishna stood in the forefront, and presently the door opened. In a few minutes Pandit watched the girl disappear inside. He waited nervously, licking dry lips with a parched tongue. It was early morning, but already very hot. He needed the work, any work. He needed the money which Outworlders could pay so abundantly for honest work. He wondered if the fanatic gurus ever thought of that. Then the door in front of him opened again, and a fat, unctuous-looking Ophiucan came out. He seemed to be an official of sorts. "One more," he said. "Only one. The rest of you begone." Behind Pandit there was a general press of bodies, but he was first in line and did not surrender his position. The unctuous-looking man admitted him, half expecting a bribe. Pandit passed by him. He didn't have a single copper. He approached a desk. The crowd noise outside was loud, those who had not joined the line crowing because most of those on it had been turned away. Behind the desk sat a small Denebian man of middle years. He looked nervous. "Can you fly?" he asked in a voice almost desperately thin. "Yes," Pandit said. Then the rumors were right. "How much experience?" 5 years, on and off." "You have a license?" "There are no licenses on Ophiuchus 9, Pandit pointed out. "Yes, of course. I'm sorry. Habit. You people don't lie. We try not to." "Your name?" Pandit told him. The Denebian wrote it down on a form and said, "You'll do. Pay is 20 credits a mission." It wasn't much, but it was more than Pandit had expected. "What do we fly?" he asked. Questions didn't seem welcome, but no harm trying. The Denebian looked at him and laughed. "You want the job?" "Yes, I want the job." "Then don't ask questions." Pandit nodded. "Out through that door, then. The other new pilots are assembling." And Pandit left the small office. A moment later, a buzzer sounded on the Denebian's desk. He spoke into a grid. "Orcap here. Go ahead." "The guru near the League building reports that a native Ophiucan left the building, heading for the city." "When was this?" "Yesterday morning." "And?" "Draw your own conclusions. Natives don't go near the League headquarters as a rule, do they?" "No." "And the League, of course, will want to know about the suicides?" "Yes, but—" "But nothing," said the radio voice, which belonged to the only other Denebian currently on Ophiuchus 9. "We can assume this native is a spy. For the League, or Cap." "All right. I don't see any need to worry, though." "Don't you? The gurus, like the other natives, can sham, but they can't lie. Sooner or later a guru will be brought out of trance by the League, questioned, and—" "Tell them about us?" Orcap asked in a shocked voice. "It could happen. Maybe it's happened already. There won't be any proof, of course, and the League would send a spy. Suppose I describe this native to you." Orcap said, "Go ahead," and the radio voice did so. In a shocked voice, Orcap admitted, "I've given that Ophiucan a pilot's job this morning. There can't be any doubt about it. Ah, then you see? You see? I can fix that. I can. Orcap. Orcap. You'll do nothing now. Let the spy alone for now. Then, in the empty places, you will merely announce to the pilots that there's a spy among them. Don't reveal who it is. He could not believe his ears. But they want work. They need work. They'll all be afraid the finger of guilt may point at them. They'll work like dogs for you, and I wouldn't be surprised if they uncovered the spy themselves. Yes, Orcap said. Yes, I understand. All but one thing, Orcap. There is one thing you don't understand. The spy's identity. You already told me who the spy was. Yes, but there is another spy, working for us in the League building. I never knew, said Orcap. The spy among your pilots is more than appearance indicates. Did you ever hear of Johnny Mayhem? Orcap's heart jumped into his throat. Who in the galaxy hadn't heard of Mayhem? But, he gasped, nevertheless, it is Mayhem. Orcap was suddenly afraid, more afraid than he ever had been in his life. The ubiquitous Mayhem. The fierce white sun of Ophiuchus 9 broiled down on the empty places, a featureless desert 2,000 miles across and as lividly white as bleached bone. In all that burning emptiness, the jet cargo craft looked very small and very insignificant, like black midges on the dead white sand. Midges among midges the new pilots walked. One said, "But I see no cargo." Another, "These outworlders and their mystery." All were sweating, all uncomfortable, but all grateful for the 20 credits a flight they would earn, whatever the cargo turned out to be. "What do you think?" Pandit asked Sriya. "I think I've never been so hot in my life. I feel like I'm being broiled alive." Here comes the Denibian now. They had been driven to the empty places in a sand sled. The trip had taken 2 days, but because the sled was air-conditioned, no one had objected. When they saw the half-dozen jets, they knew why a sled had taken them into the wilderness. The jets were small cargo carriers with room for pilot, co-pilot, and perhaps a ton of cargo in each. Whatever it was the Denebians wanted exported, it didn't take up much room. Orcap of Deneb walked toward them past the first of the jets. He began without preamble. "Your cargo is packed and ready to be moved in an underground vault 500 yards from here. You will break up into pairs, a pilot and co-pilot for each jet." Sriya Krishna and Pandit had already paired themselves together. "You work on your own time, getting the cargo with trundle sleds, loading it, taking off, delivering it to the Denebian freighter at the spaceport. When you are finished, you collect your pay." "Where do we sleep?" someone asked. Orcap smiled. "You didn't come out here to sleep. There is only a limited amount of cargo. The jets are swift. You will be paid according to the amount of work you do. Any other questions?" "What about food?" a plump young Ophiucan asked. "You will be given energy tablets, as many as you wish. Any other questions? No? Good. I have 2 additional things to say. First, you are not to examine your cargo under any circumstances, either here or in transit or on the space field. There are televid pickup units in each jet, so you will be watched at all times. Second—" Orcap paused and let the silence grow and spread across the dazzling white expanse. "There is a spy among you, wearing the body of an Ophiucan, but in reality, well, I don't have to tell you who he is in reality." Orcap smiled grimly. "There is only one body changer in the galaxy, but one is quite enough." One of the pilots said, a little breathlessly, "Johnny Mayhem." Orcap smiled again. "I am aware of Mayhem's identity," he said, "but I am not going to do anything about it. The pilots waited. The sun glared down balefully. "You see," Orcap told them, "we cannot be altogether sure that the rest of you are here simply to earn your 20 credits a flight. Mayhem has unwittingly become our insurance. Find Mayhem. Find the spy among you. 100 credits bonus to the man who does." Pandit looked at Sriya, who whistled. The girl said, "If they think we can finish the job without sleep, picking up cargo and flying it to the spaceport and returning for more, then 100 credits is probably more than any of us will earn. They'll all be looking like hawks for this Mayhem." "And," Pandit agreed, "if there's a native spy among them, he'll be afraid to show himself for fear they'll think he's Mayhem. Very clever of the Denebians." "To work at once," Orcap was saying. He wore a blaster on his hip, the only weapon among them. They all trudged behind him through the burning, faceless sands. Soon they reached a depression from which the sand had been cleared, bearing the white bedrock of the empty places. In the rock a square opening had been cut, shielded on each side from the shifting sands by an up-curving lip. A ramp led down into darkness. "You will find your cargo down there. Also, enough trundle sleds to go around," Orcap explained. "The cargo is crated. The crates must remain intact. Is that understood?" It was understood. Their sudden mutual suspicion a pall worse than the heat, the Ophiuchans descended the ramp. They needed the money, or they wouldn't be here. The money meant more to them than anything. This was no time to be far-sighted. Yet one of them was a spy for the Galactic League, Johnny Mayhem. One of them, but which? Pandit made a quick estimate of the number of crates. They were stacked neatly against one wall, each about 4 feet by 4 by 4. And from the size of them, a single crate would fill the cargo bay of each of the jets. Pandit made a rough estimate. 24 crates, perhaps. In the dim light, it was hard to tell. 24 crates, 6 jets, 12 Ophiuchans. 4 trips for each jet. A half-hour to load, 10 minutes to unload, an hour and a half by jet to the space field. 3 hours and 40 minutes, round trip. Say 4 hours. 4 times 4, 16. 16 hours of steady work for 80 credits. No time for mystery or suspicion. Barely time for mistrust. "You, there!" a voice called. "What are you doing?" It was one of the other Ophiuchans, quite the biggest of the lot. Pandit had seen him outside and remembered his name. He was Raj Shiva, a tall, muscular, swarthy Ophiuchan with small, alert, suspicious eyes and a livid scar alongside his jaw. "Nothing," Pandit said. "Nothing." "No, the others are loading already. I'll be watching you." For 100 credits, Pandit thought furiously, but said nothing. Sriya touched his shoulder. "I have one of the trundle sleds," she said. "Let's get about it." "Right," said Pandit. Raj Shiva watched them a few moments longer, then drifted away with his own partner. It took Pandit and Sriya, sweating copiously in the tremendous heat, a few minutes less than half an hour to load one of the crates aboard their jet. 3 of the other ships were already airborne, whining away toward the space field. Pandit looked at the crate. There were no markings on it anywhere. The wood looked new, but that meant absolutely nothing. In the dry heat of the empty places, wood would last a century, a millennium. They could not tell how old it was. "Ready?" Sriya Krishna called from the controls. Pandit had secured the crate in the cargo bay. "Ready," he responded. Moments later, acceleration thrust them back in the twin pilot seats. Sriya leveled the jet at 20,000, and they sped at 800 miles an hour toward the city and the space field just beyond it. "Do you wonder about it?" Sriya asked after a while. "About what?" "The cargo." "We aren't supposed to." "I know," Sriya laughed. "I'm a woman, you see. Pandit grinned at her. "Curiosity," he said. "A woman's trait on any world." Sriya got up from the pilot chair, but Pandit placed his hand on her shoulder and gently shoved her down again. "They have a televid unit aboard," he said. "Remember?" Sriya nodded. The jet sped on. They landed at the space field. They were the fourth jet down, and one of the other three had taken off on the return leg of the flight. A Denebian Pandit had never seen before was supervising the loincloth-garbed laborers loading the crates aboard a Denebian spacecraft. With Sriya, he delivered their crate on the trundle sled, returned with the sled to their jet, and took off. Just short of 4 hours from the time they started, they returned to the empty places. They had gained a little time and were the second team down. From the jet ahead of them, Rav Shiva led a puny, middle-aged co-pilot. Orcap stood in the underground storage room. Looking at his wrist chrono, he said to the 4 Ophiuchans who came down the ramp, "You made fine time." Raj Shiva's puny companion said something, but Raj Shiva grabbed his arm and they began to load a second crate. Pandit and Sriya loaded theirs in silence. They made their second round trip in 4 hours exactly. It was completely dark when they returned to the empty places. Sriya was worried they would overshoot the cargo point, but Pandit brought the little jet down within a few hundred yards of its takeoff point. They could see nothing when they shut off the jet's running lights, except for the glow which came from the underground room. They reached it and went down the ramp. Pandit judged that half the crates were gone now. He took a quick tour of the dimly lit room while Sriya got the trundle sled into position against one of the crates. "Nobody here," Pandit said in a whisper. "The Denebian must be sleeping in the sand sled." "Yes," Sriya said a little breathlessly. "I was thinking." "What?" Sriya said. "Don't stop." "If we wanted to examine one of the boxes, it would be suicide to open the one we take. But we could open one of them down here, see what it is, take another for ourselves." "You would do this?" Sriya asked him. "Why?" Pandit shrugged. "I have eyes," he said. "Our gurus did not broadcast the death wish to outworlders until the Denebians came. Then they started. Have the Denebians sold them on the idea?" "I don't know," Sriya said. "Well, let's assume they have. Why? Why would they do such a thing, Sriya?" "Let me get this straight, Pandit. First, you think the gurus actually are making the outworlders kill themselves?" "Of course," Pandit said. "It's mental suggestion, on a scale only our gurus are capable of. But don't you see, Sriya, they wouldn't do it on their own. The gurus are dirty, careless about their bodies, but terribly arrogant. Left alone, they wouldn't think the outworlders important enough to be concerned over one way or another. They certainly wouldn't kill them." "Go on," Sriya urged. "All right, the gurus have great knowledge of the mystical, but externally they're naive. Let's suppose someone came along, the Denebians in this case, and found something they wanted very badly on Ophiuchus. These crates here, Sriya. What would they do? They'd go to the gurus and convince them, it wouldn't be difficult, that any intercourse with outworlders would be harmful to Ophiuchus, that the outworlders want to colonize and exploit our world, that sort of thing. While the gurus are stewing it over, the Denebians could have prepared this shipment here, whatever it is, for departure. But the gurus, too well convinced by them, could have acted sooner than they expected, making it all but impossible for the small handful of outworlders, the Denebians among them, to go abroad without fear of taking their own lives. Perhaps a few, like Orcap and that other Denebian, are not at all suicide-prone. Perhaps a few can withstand it. As for the rest, it's indoors and away from the mental influence of the gurus, or off Ophiuchus entirely, which would leave the Denebians with the problem they hadn't thought of." His words made sense. "Yes," cried Sriya excitedly. "Now that they have their valuable cargo ready to go, how can they get it off Ophiuchus without help?" "We," said Pandit softly, "are that help." Sriya asked, "What are you going to do about it?" "I don't know. I honestly don't. I never had anything against the Outworlders. How could I? We're all progeny of Outworlders who came here almost 500 years ago from a place called India on Earth. But the Gurus have been deceived. You said so yourself." Pandit was sweating, and it was more than the heat which made him sweat. He paced up to the crates, then back again, then to the crates. Suddenly he said, All right, I'll do it. Someone's got to find out what the Denemians want here." And Pandit began to pry at one of the boxes with a knife he carried in his loincloth. Sriya said, "I'll keep watch. You call me when it's opened. Maybe you ought to get out of here. In case anything happens, I don't want you to get involved." But Sriya went up the ramp and crouched there, waiting, watching. The desert was very quiet, entirely windless and hot even at night. Stars sprinkled the sky overhead, and far off she thought she heard the distant whine of a jet. "Hurry," she called. From below she heard the sound of wood being pried away from wood. She heard, or imagined she heard, the jet coming closer. "Hurry," she called softly. Finally, 3 words drifted up to her. "Come here, Sriya." She felt a little relieved, now that he'd finished. She listened for the jet. Now she heard nothing. She went swiftly down the ramp. Pandit stood before one of the crates, perspiring freely. He had pried loose one of the side walls, and a smooth metal surface with stencil lettering on it was exposed. He said, "I can't read that. It's a language I never saw before." Sriya bent closer and looked at the stenciled lettering. A voice, not Pandit, said, "I thought it would be you too. No, don't move." A big, muscular figure silhouetted against the starlight, and a smaller, puny, thin-legged figure. Raj Shiva and his co-pilot. 100 credits each, Handus," Raj Shiva said as he ran down the ramp. "Can you keep the girl from getting away?" Handus rushed down at his heels. Pandit met Raj Shiva at the foot of the ramp. Pandit was a big man by Ophiucan standards, but Raj Shiva was bigger. "Run, Sriya!" Pandit cried, and met the giant with his knife. Raj Shiva parried the blow with his forearm, then his big hands moved swiftly and the knife clattered to the floor. Sriya ran for the ramp, her bare feet padding swiftly against the stone floor. Handus was waiting for her at the foot of the ramp in an awkward crouch. She had a glimpse of Raj Shiva and Pandit straining together. Then Handus struck her with his balled fist. It was a puny blow, but Sriya staggered back, her jaw numb. Laughing shrilly, Handus leapt at her. She was shoved back, tripped over something, and fell. For a moment all the lights blinked out inside her head. Inside, no. Raj Shiva and Pandit stumbled about the room, struck something. There was a loud popping sound, a tinkling, and the lights in the storage room went out. "Where is she?" Handus called. "I can't find her." She heard him groping about, heard the others struggling together. She got to her feet and stood perfectly still, waiting for anything. She wished she had a weapon, something. She was only a woman. Then a voice whispered, "Hurry, Sriya, hurry." "Pandit?" He took her arm in the darkness. She couldn't see him. They went to the crates and wrestled one on their trundle sled. "Not the open one?" Sriya gasped. "No, no." They heard footsteps, saw a figure for a moment silhouetted against the starlight. Handus was fleeing, probably for help. They took their sled out into the night and dragged it across the sand toward their waiting jet. They loaded the crate in the cargo bay. While Pandit was finishing the job in the darkness, Sriya sat down at the controls. "Ready?" she shouted above the whine of the jets. Pandit said that he was. She hardly heard his voice. A moment later, she took their small cargo jet up. She heard Pandit moving in the small cabin behind her. She said, "We ought to take it to the League authorities, don't you think?" She had to shout to be heard above the whining roar of the jets. "Why?" "I was able to read the writing. It's Procyon, Pandit. Do you know anything about the Procyonians? Well, A few centuries ago, they were the most warlike people in the galaxy. It was rumored that they had a cache of thermonuclear bombs hidden somewhere after such weapons were outlawed in the 25th century. The cache was never found until tonight. We found it, Pandit. But, Orcap, and that's true, it was found by the Denebians first. Don't you see, Pandit? Orcap and the others, private Denebian traders. It wasn't the government. It never is the government these days. But unscrupulous individuals, Pandit, armed with 24 hydrogen bombs. Why, they could take over their own world on threat of imminent destruction, or some outworld plum they have their eye on, or— "I see." Pandit's voice was barely audible above the whine of the jets. "It's a job the Galactic League can handle," Sriya went on. "Now that it's out in the open, or will be as soon as we get to the space field. You've done your work, Pandit, and your people won't forget you for it. As for me, my work here is done too." "Your work?" Above the roar of the jet, Sriya shouted, "Yes, I am Johnny Mayhem." She smiled in the darkness. Johnny Mayhem, she thought, in a girl's body. Well, he'd been young men and old, weak and strong, sick and healthy, human and alien outworlder. So why not a girl, too? All at once, Pandit's hand lay heavily on her shoulder. She turned around, and in the darkness, but with the lights of the instrument board on it, saw the gleam of a knife blade. The face beyond the blade, leering from darkness, was not Pandit's. She hadn't actually known it was Pandit. She hadn't seen him. She'd hardly been able to hear his voice. It was Raj Shiva. "Fly us to the Nebian exports," he said, "or I'll kill you and do it myself." "You're making a mistake. Your people belong with the Galactic League, not with a handful of adventurers who— The Denebians are right," Raj Shiva said fanatically. "My people would be better off left alone. I'm flying this jet to the spaceport and the League. I'll kill you. I know all about you, Mayhem. You're not a woman, really. You're not even a native. That's a dead body, isn't it? But if I kill it again while you're in it, you die too. You'll do what I say." This very night, unless something was done about it, the cache of thermonuclear weapons would be spacebound, the first hydrogen bombs loose in the galaxy for almost 500 years. Wouldn't mankind ever begin to learn? Mayhem Sriya thought wearily. He knew the answer, of course. Most men would, but the few who refused could bring destruction to an entire galaxy. Moments before, apparent success of a mission. Now, failure, or death, or both. Sriya's hand flashed out suddenly and struck the instrument board. The jet plummeted earthward with a loud whining sound. Sriya felt herself shoved back by the tremendous acceleration into the cushions of the pilot chair. She heard a wild exclamation from Raj Shiva, but couldn't turn around to see what had happened. Grim-lipped, she kept the ship hurtling earthward. She knew it was dangerous and might even prove disastrous. Her body could take so much, then she would black out. But if she didn't maintain the dive until the last possible instant, Raj Shiva would get control of the ship and its vital cargo. She was only a girl, but she was protected by the crash padding of the pilot chair. Raj Shiva, unprotected, was behind her somewhere. Down through the thin upper atmosphere of Ophiuchus 9 screamed the small ship, its heat dial blinking on and off in warning as friction scorched its thin shell. The scream of air became more deep-throated as the atmosphere became thicker. 10,000 feet, 8,000, 6. Sriya's eyes saw black. Her breath was labored. Needles of pain darted in her skull, plucked at her eyes. She opened her mouth to scream, but heard nothing. She felt as if she must be forced clear through the protective cushions of the pilot chair. 5,000 feet, 4,000. Blackness and peace and a settling lassitude. 3,000 feet. With hands that could barely function, Sria, with supreme effort, brought the jet out of its death dive. She slumped in the pilot chair for a long time, too weak to do anything else. Then she looked back at Rav Shiva, who lay slack and unconscious against the rear bulkhead of the cargo ship. Mayhem Sria brought the jet down, and, middle of the night or no, saw Govindaswamy. Rav Shiva was taken into custody. A jet was sent out, loaded with Leaguemen who had proved immune to the Guru death wish and all armed to the teeth. It landed at the cache and stood guard over it. Pandit was found, unconscious, one of his arms broken, but otherwise all right. A second jet prevented the Denebian export ship from blasting off with the hydrogen bombs already loaded. Orcap and his companion were taken into custody. The rest, of course, is history. The gurus of Ophiuchus IX were shown what had been taking place in the name of friendship between themselves and Deneb, and in the name of isolation. Most of the gurus retired entirely from active life. The few who did not spent the rest of their days working for cooperation between Ophiuchus and the rest of the Galactic League. Orcap and his companion were sent back to Deneb for punishment. 2 weeks later, Govindaswamy shook Sriya's hand. "A girl," he said. "You did it as a girl. I still can't believe it. But then, of such stuff is the Mayhem legend made." Mayhem smiled. Already, the hub had a new assignment for him. He could feel the old excitement, the wonder stirring him. He smiled again and told Govindaswamy, "Better not tell that fellow Pandit. I think he had a crush on Sriya." The end of Think Yourself to Death, a Johnny Mayhem adventure by C.H. Thames.
Vital Ingredient by Charles V. DeVette. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by W. M. Hinsch. Vital Ingredient by Charles V. DeVette. It is man's most precious possession. No living thing can exist without it. But when they gave it to Orville, it killed him. For the answer, read 1/m. Vital Ingredient by Charles V. DeVette. "Now watch," Rym said, indicating the native. Macker had been absent, exploring the countryside in the immediate vicinity of their landing place, and had not witnessed the capture of the native, or the tests his two companions made on it. Macker followed Rym's gaze to where the biped native sat hunched. The creature was bent into an ungainly position, its body crooked at incongruous angles, in such a way as to allow most of its weight to rest on a packing box at the base of a middle angle. Its stubby feet, on the ends of thin, pipe-like legs, rested against the floor of the spaceship. Its body was covered, almost entirely, with an artificial skin material of various colors. Some of the colors hurt Macker's eyes. In the few places where the flesh showed through, the skin was an unhealthy, pallid white. Slowly the creature's head swiveled on its short neck until it faced them. "Those orifices in the upper portion of its skull are evidently organs of sight," Rym said. "It sees that we are quite a distance away. It will probably attempt to escape again." Slowly, slowly, the native's head rotated away from them in a half-circle until it faced Tools, working over his instruments on the far side of the room. Then it turned its head back until it faced the door of the ship. "It is setting itself for flight now," Rym said. "Notice the evidence of strain on its face." The creature leaned forward, and the appendages on the ends of its upper limbs clutched the sides of the box as it propelled its body forward. It raised its right foot in a slow arc, employing a double-jointed braking action of its leg. For a long moment it rested its entire weight on its lumpy right foot, while its momentum carried its body sluggishly forward. Then it repeated the motion with its left leg, then again its right, all the while evidencing great exertion and concentration of effort. "It is making what it considers a mad dash for freedom," Rem said, "probably at the ultimate speed of which it is capable. That would be ridiculous, except that it's normal for its own environment. This is definitely a slow-motion world." The creature was a third way to the door now. Once again its head turned in its slow quarter circle to look at them. As it saw that Rem and Macker had not moved, it altered the expression on its face. "It seems to express its emotions through facial contortions," Rem said, "though I suspect that the sounds it makes with the upper part of its trachea during moments of agitation are also outlets of emotional stress, rather than efforts at communication." He called across the room to Tools. "What did you find out about its speech?" "Extremely primitive," Tools replied. "Incredible as it may appear to us, it uses combinations of sounds to form word symbols. Each word indicates some action or object, or denotes degree, time, or shades of meaning. Other words are merely connectives. It seems to make little use of inflections, the basis of a rational language. Thoughts which we could project with a few sounds would take it dozens of words to express." "Just how intelligent is it?" Macker asked. "Only as intelligent as a high degree of self-preservation instinct would make it." "Are you certain that it is a member of the dominant species of life on the planet?" "There's no doubt about it," Tools replied. "I've made very careful observations." "This attempt at escape is a pretty good example of its intelligence," Rem said. "This is the 6th time it has tried to escape, in exactly the same way. As soon as it sees that we are farther away from it than it is from the door, it makes its dash." The creature was one step away from the spaceship's open portal now, and bringing its foot up to cross the threshold, Rem walked over and lifted it off the floor. "Its legs are still moving in a running motion," Macker said. "Doesn't it realize yet that you've picked it up?" "Its nervous system and reflexes are evidently as slow as its motor muscles," Rem replied. "There has not been time for the sensation of my picking it up to reach the brain, and for the brain to send back its message to the legs to stop their running motion." "How heavy is it?" Macker asked. "Only a few ounces," Rem replied. "But that's logical, considering that this is a light planet. If we took it back to our own heavy world, gravity would crush it to a light film of the liquid which comprises the greater part of its substance." Rem set the creature down on the box in its former queerly contorted position. Tools had left his instruments and strolled over beside them to observe the native. "One of its appendages seems bent at a peculiar angle," Macker said. "I noticed that," Rem answered. "I think that I may have broken the bone in several places when I first captured it. I was not aware then of how fragile it was. But now that you mention it, I should be able to use that injury to give you a good illustration of the interplay of emotional expressions on its face. Observe now as I touch it." Rem reached over and touched, very lightly, the broken portion of the native's appendage. The muscles of the creature's face pulled its flaccid flesh into distorted positions, bunching some and stretching others. "It is very probably registering pain," Rem said. Suddenly the starch seemed to leave the native's body, and it slowly slumped across the packing box. "Why is it doing that, Tools?" Rem asked. Tools concentrated for a minute, absorbing the feelings and thought pulsations emanating from the creature. "The conscious plane of its mind has blanked out," he said. "I presume the pain you caused by touching its wounded member resulted in a breakdown of its nervous system. The only thought waves I receive now are disjointed impressions and pictures following no rational series. However, I'm certain that it will be only temporary." "Don't you think that, in justice to the creature, we should repair its wound before we free it?" Macker asked. "I intended to have it done," Rem replied. "You shouldn't have any trouble fixing it, should you, Tools?" No, Tools answered. I may as well attend to it right now. He rolled the portable converter over beside the creature and carefully laid its arm in the pan. The converter automatically set its gauges and instruments of calculation and gave its click of ready. Tools fed a short length of basic into the machine, and it began its work. The native was still unconscious. The bone of the wounded arm slowly evaporated, beginning with the wrist joint. The evaporated portion was instantly replaced by the manufactured bone of the converter. At the same time, it repaired all ruptured blood vessels and damaged ligaments and muscles. It was not possible, of course, for me to replace the bone with another of the same composition as its own, Tools said after the machine had completed its work, but I gave it one of our heavy ones. There will be no force on this planet powerful enough to break it again. The native's first evidence of a return to consciousness was a faint fluttering of the lids that covered its organs of vision. The lids opened, and it looked up at them. Its eyesight is as slow as its muscular reactions, Rem said. Watch. Rem raised his hand and waved it slowly in front of the native's face. The eyes of the native, moving in odd, jerking movements, followed the hand's progress. Rem raised the hand, speeding its action slightly, and the eyesight faltered and lost it. The native's eyes rolled wildly until, once again, they located the hand. Rem took 3 steps forward. The native's eyes were unable to follow his change of position. Its gaze wandered about the room until again it settled on Rem's waiting figure. "Can you imagine anything being so slow?" Rem said. "And still," suddenly Macker interrupted, "something is wrong. It is trying to get up, but it can't." The native was registering signs of distress, kicking its legs and twisting its body into new positions of contortion. "I see what the trouble is," Tools said. "It is unable to lift the appendage with the new bone in. I never thought of that before, but its light muscles aren't strong enough to lift the limb. We've got the poor creature pinned to the box by the weight of its own arm." "We can't do that to it," Rem said. "Isn't there any way you can give it a lighter bone?" "None that wouldn't take a retooling of the converter," Tools said. "I'm not certain that I could do it. And even if I could, we don't have the time to spare. I could give it stronger muscles in the arm, but that may throw off the metabolism of the whole body. If it did, the result would be fatal. I'd hate to chance it." "I have an idea," Macker said. By the inflections of his tones, the others knew that some incongruity of the situation had aroused Macker's sense of humor. "Why don't we give the creature an entirely new body? We could replace the flesh and viscera, as well as the cartilaginous structure, with our own type substance. It would probably be an indestructible being as far as its own world is concerned, and it would be as powerful as their mightiest machines. We'd leave behind us a Superman that could change the course of this world's history. You could do it, couldn't you, Tools?" "Quite simply. Our policy has always been not to interfere in any way with the races we study," Rem protested. "But our policy has also been never to harm any of them, if at all possible to avoid it," Macker insisted. "In common justice, you have to complete the job Tools began on the arm, or you're condemning this poor thing to death." "But do we have the right to loose such an unpredictable factor as it would be among them?" Rem asked. "After all, our purpose is exploration and observation, not playing the parts of gods to the primitives we encounter." "True, that is the rule which we have always followed in the past," Macker agreed, "but it is in no way a requirement. We are empowered to use our judgment in all circumstances, and in this particular instance I believe I can convince you that the course I suggest is the more just one." He turned to Tools. "Just what stage of cultural development would you say this creature's race has attained?" "It still retains more of an animal-like adaptation to its surroundings than an intellectual one," Tools replied. "Its civilization is divided into various sized units of cooperation, which it calls governments. Each unit vies with the others for a greater share of its world's goods. That same rivalry is carried down to the individual within the unit. Each strives for acquisition against his neighbor. Further, they retain many of their tribal instincts, such as gregariousness, emotional rather than intellectual propagation, and worship of the mightiest fighter. This last, however, is manifested by reverence for individuals attaining position of authority, or acquiring large amounts of their medium of exchange, rather than by physical superiority. That's what I mean, Macker said. Our policy in the past has been to avoid tampering only because of the fear of bringing harm. If we created a super being among them to act as a controlling and harmonizing force, we'd hasten their development by thousands of years. We'd be granting them the greatest possible boon. I don't know, Rym said, obviously swayed by Macker's logic. I'm still hesitant about introducing a being into their midst whose thought processes would be so subtle and superior to their own. How do you feel about it, Tools? What would they have to lose? Tools asked, with his penchant for striking the core of an argument. The right or wrong of such moral and philosophical considerations has always been a delicate thing to decide, Rym acquiesced reluctantly. Go ahead if you think it is the right thing to do. All finished? Macker asked. That depends on how much you want me to do, Tools replied. I've substituted our heavy substances for his entire body structure, including the brain, at the same time transferring his former memory and habit impressions. That was necessary if he is to be able to care for himself. Also, I brought his muscular reaction time up to our norm and speeded his reflexes. Have you implanted any techniques which he did not possess before, such as far-seeing or mental insight? Macker asked. No, Toole said. That is what I want your advice about. Just how much should I reveal about ourselves and our background, or should he be left without any knowledge of us? Well, now that the others had deferred to Macker's argument, he had lost much of his certainty. Perhaps we should at least let him know who we are and what we have done. That would save him much alarm and perplexity when it comes time to reorient himself. On the other hand, perhaps we should go even farther and implant the knowledge of some of our sciences. Then he could do a better job of advancing his people. But maybe I'm wrong. What do you think about it, Rym? My personal opinion, Rym said, is that we can't give him much of our science, because it would be like giving a baby a high explosive to play with. His race is much too primitive to handle it wisely. Either he or someone to whom he imparts what we teach him would be certain to bring catastrophe to his world. And if we let him learn less but still remember his contact with us, in time his race would very likely come to regard us as gods. I would hesitate to drag in any metaphysical confusion to add to the uncertainties you are already engendering. My advice would be to wipe his mind of all memory of us. Let him explain his newfound invincibility to himself in his own way. Macker had no criticism to offer to this suggestion. Does he retain any of his immunity to this world's malignant germs? He asked. They are too impotent to represent any hazard to his present body mechanism, Tools replied. If and when he dies, it will not be from disease. He will be subject to the deterioration of old age, the same as we are, won't he? Macker asked. Of course, Tools said, but that's the only thing that will be able to bring him down. He cannot be harmed by any force this light world can produce. He is impervious to sickness, and he will live indefinitely. Indefinitely? As his world reckons time, their normal lifespan is less than 100 years. Ours is over 5,000. He will probably live approximately twice that long because he will be subjected to less stress and strain, living as he does on a world of lighter elements. And we have truly made a Superman. Macker's tones inflected satisfaction. I wish we were returning this way in 1,000 years or so. I'd like to see the monumental changes he will effect. We may at that, Rym said, or others of our people will. He will probably be a living legend by then. I'd like to hear what his race has to say about him. Do they have names with which to differentiate individuals? Yes, Tools said. This one has a family name of Paulnow and a member designation of Orville. It will be necessary for us to leave in exactly 10 minutes, Rym reminded them. Our next stopping place, the Red Star, will reach its nearest conjunction with this planet by the time we meet it out in space. Then we will have time to do nothing more for him before we go, Macker said. But as far as I can see, we've forgotten nothing. Have we, Tools? Nothing, Tools answered. No, we forgot nothing. But Tools was wrong. They had forgotten one thing, a minor detail, relatively. On Tools's world, his race, in the course of its evolution, had adjusted itself to its own particular environment. Logically, the final result was that they had evolved into beings best able to survive in that environment. As such, their food, a heavy, highly concentrated food, was ideally suited to supply the needs of their heavy, tremendously avid organisms. Orville Pollnow had no such food available. His body, no larger than before, had an earth mass of 180,000 pounds. 180,000 pounds, the weight of 1,200 average-sized men, of fiercely burning, intense virility. Even continuous eating of his own world's food could not supply the demands of that body. 24 hours after the aliens left, Pollnow was dead of starvation. The end. End of Vital Ingredient by Charles V. DeVette. Recording by W. M. Hinsch, Columbia, South Carolina.